The Dogs Gravedigger. Rick swerved a fraction of a second too late. His car tires screamed, leaving black tracks on the asphalt. Then there was a muffled thump. Rick felt a jolt move through his body, and the car rocked to a halt. For a moment, Rick didn't dare do anything except breathe. Then he swore loudly and threw open the door. His car's high beam sliced through the midnight darkness, leaving trails of pale gold on the road. The markings from his tires spread out in a lazy loop, starting where he'd first seen the dog and ending 3 feet too late. Rick knelt beside his car and looked over at the result of his accident. The lumpy, bloody clump of fur was definitely dead and was barely recognizable as a dog. The impact must have killed it instantly. Thank goodness for small blessings at least. Rick grimaced and felt around its neck. It didn't have a collar. A stray then? It does look kinda thin. Something about its nose, though, made him think it was a purebred. It might have been a stray when he'd hit it. He suspected it was because there wasn't any houses for 20 minutes in each direction, but it had probably been someone's pet at one time. Rick swore again and pulled off his jacket. He'd lost a dog of his own when he was a child. The driver hadn't even stopped. The inhumanity had cut him deeply, and even 20 years later, he couldn't imagine leaving an animal on the side of a road. It had belonged to a child that would have wanted his pet to be treated respectfully. The body mostly hung together, though one of the legs was only attached by a strip of flesh and a few muscles. Rick shrugged out of his jacket. Good thing I'm wearing the cheap one tonight. And wrapped it around the dog, then carefully lifted the bundle into the passenger seat. He returned to the driver's seat and hesitated as he tried to decide what to do with the animal. He could take it to a vet and hope they dispose of it kindly, or he could take it home and bury it in his backyard. Rick put the car into gear, a smile growing across his face as he remembered what he'd stored in the trunk. He'd bought a full set of gardening equipment the week before, and hadn't got around to moving it out of the car. In amongst the shears, spades, and gloves was a shovel, and surrounding him was a fresh forest. Yes, a burial in the woods. It's where a body will nurture the trees. It's the best thing to do. Rick drove until he found a gap in the trees wide enough for him to maneuver the car into. He drove past it, then reversed, so that the back of the car would be facing the woods. He was able to get the car about 20 paces into the woods before it became too thick for him to continue. It wasn't quite far enough to disguise the car if a wayward driver happened to look at his direction, but at least it was more private than leaving his vehicle on the road. He had hoped no one would see him. Goodness knew what a passerby might think if they seen a lone man digging a hole in the woods 1/4 past midnight. Rick turned off the car, smothering the headlights. The moon was full and bright, and the trees were sparse enough to let plenty of natural illumination through. The fallen pine needles crunched under his feet as he rounded the car and opened the trunk. Inside were tools laying on a tarp. He took the shovel, walked 10 paces to a clear patch of ground, and started digging. The dirt was tightly packed, but not as bad as he'd been expecting. Even so, it was exhausting work. He had started sweating before the hole was even deeper than his arm. It's gotta be deep enough, he thought. The wild animals can't smell it and dig it out. The air was frosty, and his breath plumed in front of his face every time he had exhaled. He knew his fingers would have been numb if the exercise hadn't been pumping blood through them so quickly. A car came down the road, and Rick froze. The vehicle was traveling quickly, though, and passed Rick's hiding place without slowing down. The rural road was rarely traveled, even during the day. Rick hadn't passed any cars during the last 10 minutes of his drive, so he didn't expect to be disturbed again. He dug and dug until the sweat stained his underarms and back of his t-shirt, and stuck his dark hair to his forehead. He'd made a good hole, a little larger than the dog would need to be deep enough that the bones wouldn't come up for a long time. Everyone deserves peace. Panting, his arms trembling from the exertion, Rick climbed out of the hole and turned back to the car. Instead of going to the jacket-wrapped bundle in the passenger seat, he went to the trunk and pushed the tools off a tarp. He then grabbed the corner of the blue material and pulled it out of the trunk, strained against the weight. Dead weight. He chuckled to himself as he hauled the baggage towards the hole. She'd go in with the tarp, of course. A little insurance to protect her from being dug up. The tarp couldn't be traced back to him. He bought it 2 states away at the same time as the tools, a complete set. To ensure there's no suspicion, he paid with cash. As far as anyone knew, the last time he'd seen his wife was that morning, when she kissed him on the cheek and left for work. Her car would be found abandoned at the train station the following day. Rick gave the bundle a final shove and watched it tumble into the hole. Then he returned to the passenger seat of the car and drew the dog out with significantly more care. The dog had never cheated on him. The dog had never lied to him, and in all likelihood, the dog had never had a malicious thought. He knelt on the edge of the grave and laid the animal body on top of his wife. Then he sat pouring the mound of dirt over the pair of them. We all need rest, he thought.